And now, I'm very proud to present to you our president, Michael Ferner.
Good morning. Congresswoman Edwards, comrades and Iraq veterans against the war, and military families speak out, Sister Shazia Shakib from Afghanistan, and brothers and sisters of Veterans for Peace. In Paul Newman's 1967 classic, Cool Hand Luke, the prison boss in the white uniform, memorably played by Strother Martin, repeatedly tells Luke, "You gotta get your old mind right." That turned out to be literally a grave warning for Luke, but it also happens to be exactly what we need to hear today. We open our 24th annual convention against a backdrop of a crippled economy, sweeping foreclosures, widespread unemployment, millions without medical benefits, wars that now exceed $1 trillion and have killed over 1 million people. It's a fair question to ask that with a name like Veterans for Peace, should we be concerned with issues that go so far beyond opposing war? I believe the answer is yes, because war and economic calamities are not only connected. One is the dominant cause of all the others, and Veterans for Peace is particularly well suited to make that point. As we open our convention, I'd like to open a discussion on something even more fundamental than war and economic calamity. And as is true so many times when talking about fundamentals, I'd like to refer to something Dr. Martin Luther King said. The same year Cool Hand Luke was showing in the theaters, Dr. King spoke at Riverside Church in New York, giving what many believe was his greatest speech beyond Vietnam. In it, he called the United States, quote, "the greatest purveyor of violence in the world." Time magazine called King's speech demagogic slander that sounded like a script for Radio Hanoi. But every word in King's speech was true and timeless. Here are a couple of gems. What we are submitting our troops to is not simply the brutalizing process that goes on in any war. We are adding cynicism to the process of death, for our soldiers must know, after a short period there, that none of the things we claim to be fighting for are really involved. Americans who calculate so carefully military victory do not realize that in the process they are incurring deep psychological and political defeat. And then 42 years ago, he spoke words that could have been addressed to us today. This war is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. And if we ignore this reality, we will find ourselves organizing clergy and laymen concerned committees for the next generation. They will be concerned about Guatemala, Cambodia, South Africa. We will be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end, unless there is a significant and profound change in American life. My daughter brought this home to me right after the invasion of Iraq when she said, "This is my generation's war, just like Vietnam was yours, isn't it?" So here we are, organizing another generation of anti-war committees, attending rallies without end. It's still necessary, we'll keep doing it, but frankly, I'm getting sick of it. I'm tired of being that vet for peace guy that knows how to make history dance by quoting Smedley Butler. I long for the time when Veterans for Peace can build its membership on a reputation for creating a peaceful world and its practical nonviolence skills, not just because we leapt to the front ranks of yet another war. Chris Hedges wrote that war is a force that gives us meaning. Could it also be true that anti-war is a force that gives us meaning? If we are content to be an anti-war movement, or a peace movement in name only, we'll have work that will give us plenty of meaning for this generation, our children's generation, and for the next, if in fact the planet is still breathing. No, what we need is a peace movement that is true to our chants in the streets. No justice, no peace. Peace with justice means stopping the few from making policy for the many, from robbing us blind, denying our right to health care, destroying Earth's life support systems, as well as sending us to war. Peace with justice needs a foundation. That foundation is democracy. Not democracy as advertised on TV or that gets thrown around during elections, but the real thing. We must govern ourselves because we've seen what happens when we don't. Imagine a peace movement that's part of a larger democracy movement. We talk about outreach to other groups. We talk about defunding the war to fund human needs. But brothers and sisters, what is our vision? Stopping the F-22 or trading an aircraft carrier for a housing program? It has to be more than that. What we need is to govern ourselves so we can create the kind of life we have an indisputable, undeniable right to. But we aren't going to gain the power needed to govern ourselves if we expend our precious time toiling in an isolated peace movement that merely wants to get our troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Just as we won't become self-governing with an environmental movement that aims only for more solar panels and cars with better mileage. We need to get our minds right so we can see ourselves not as mere workers and consumers, but as the human beings with an absolute right to define what kind of life we need and take it. We need to create a culture of democracy from the bottom up to replace our culture of death. We need to change our government from what it is today, a huge roadblock, guarded round the clock by greed and private interests, into a vehicle that nourishes the public interest that helps us express our love for each other and the planet. I believe there is a hunger for self-governance and democracy in America, and that hunger is the fundamental link between the peace movement and every other movement working to address human needs. I don't need to remind this audience of war's real cost. We can't even identify all the categories into which we pour war's staggering sums. Less than 5% of what we've spent in Iraq and Afghanistan would pay the tuition of every student attending public university in the U.S. this year. Beyond dollars, we know war's human toll on individuals, families, and whole communities is as impossible to quantify as the heartache of a single loved one, as impossible to calculate as the multiples of misery endured by those under our bombs. If we in this country experienced casualties comparable to those just in Iraq, it would mean, and listen for where you live, that every person in Baltimore, Boston, Dallas, Philadelphia, San Diego, San Francisco, and Seattle would be dead. Every single person. Everyone in Delaware, Idaho, Nebraska, Nevada, New York, and Oregon would be wounded. Every single person. Everyone in Michigan, Indiana, and Kentucky be refugees to Canada or Mexico, and the entire populations of Ohio and New Jersey would be homeless. What's astounding is that so many insist that this kind of madness is practical, it's realistic, and yet would look at VFP's bottom line to abolish war as an instrument of national policy and say that's crazy. How can this be? How can we think how much we pay this system every year to produce this culture of death and then define it as normal? In fact, as the only way to live unless we want to freeze to death in the dark. There is one good thing about all this when we realize what a constant Herculean effort the system must make to construct such a massive delusion and maintain it in the face of everything rational. We begin to see how fragile the empire really is. If you doubt that, recall